There are things you learn quickly when you work for a man like Hak Jin Yoon. You learn that silence from him is never empty. It carries weight, intention, sometimes consequence. You learn that when his eyes settle on something, they don't let go easily. You learn that his instructions are given once, never twice, and that the space between what he says and what he means is where most people get lost. I learned all of that in 14 months. What I hadn't learned, what I was apparently still failing at, was how to keep my personal life from bleeding into his world. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. That stretch of days had a way of dissolving into each other when Hak Jin was in pre-deal negotiations, because my schedule stopped being mine the moment his became complicated. I hadn't slept properly in 4 days. My apartment in Midtown smelled like takeout containers and stress, and I was sitting on the floor of my living room at 9:30 in the evening, surrounded by printed contract drafts and an overturned box of paper clips I hadn't bothered to pick up. I looked terrible. I knew I looked terrible. My hair was in a knot that had stopped being intentional somewhere around hour 6, and I was wearing an oversized Atlanta Falcons shirt, my brother Marcus's, from years ago, with a small bleach stain near the hem that I'd never gotten around to throwing away. I had reading glasses on that I only wore alone, because they made me look 12, and there was a mug of cold coffee on the floor beside me that I kept reaching for, and then remembering I'd already finished. This was the version of Marianne that no one at work ever saw. I had my laptop open, cross-referencing a supply chain clause that Hak Jin had flagged 2 days ago as potentially problematic. He hadn't explained why. He never explained why. Not at first. But I'd learned to trust his instincts enough to dig until I found it myself. And I was close. The issue was buried in an indemnification subclause that looked clean on the surface but created a liability loop that could be exploited under 3 very specific circumstances. I was drafting a memo about it when my phone buzzed on the carpet beside me. Not a call. Not a message. My front door buzzer. I frowned at it. The intercom screen on my phone showed the lobby feed, and what I saw made my stomach drop so fast I actually put a hand on the floor to steady myself. There were 2 men I didn't recognize standing near the entrance. Broad, still, their posture, the kind that comes from years of training rather than intention. And between them, slightly ahead, hands in his pockets, looking at nothing in particular the way only people who own every room they walk into look at nothing, was Hak Jin. In my building. At 9:30 on a Tuesday. I didn't move for a full 3 seconds. Then I scrambled. The papers went sideways. I kicked the mug. It didn't break, but cold coffee splashed across 2 contract pages, and I made a sound that wasn't a word. I pulled the reading glasses off my face so fast, one arm caught in my hair, and I had to yank it free. I was looking around the apartment with the desperate energy of someone who had about 90 seconds and no realistic plan. Hak Jin didn't visit people. That wasn't a thing he did. In 14 months, I had always gone to him. To the offices on 57th Street. To the private dining room at the restaurant on the Upper East Side he used for certain meetings, once to a warehouse in Red Hook that I pretended I hadn't memorized the address of. He summoned. He did not arrive. The buzzer sounded again. Patient. Unhurried. Like he had all the time in the world and was simply making note of the delay. I pressed the intercom button. Mr. Yoon. My voice came out steadier than I felt, which was the only mercy the evening offered me. You didn't mention, open the door, Marianne. That was all. 4 words. Quiet, the way everything from him was quiet, and I felt them land somewhere between my sternum and my spine. I buzzed him in. I had maybe 45 seconds while he rode the elevator. I grabbed the takeout containers, 3 of them, and shoved them into the kitchen trash. I kicked the paper clips under the coffee table. I could do nothing about the spilled coffee or the general state of the living room, or the fact that I was wearing my dead brother's old football shirt and had mascara smudged beneath my left eye from rubbing my face an hour ago. I pulled the knot out of my hair and shook it loose, which helped approximately nothing. The knock came. I took one breath. Then I opened the door. Hakjin stood in the hallway with the same ease he carried everywhere. Black suit, no tie. The top button of his white shirt open the way it sometimes was late in the day. The tattoos at his collar were visible, dark ink against his neck, the kind of detail that felt almost shocking in the soft light of my apartment hallway compared to the polished environments where I usually encountered him. His 2 men had stopped at the elevator. They were already facing away, watching the corridor. They didn't look at me. He did. His gaze moved across me. Not slowly, not rudely, just completely. The way he assessed everything. My hair, the shirt, the smudge under my eye. The paper clip I'd apparently missed that was sitting right in the middle of the floor behind me. I waited for him to say something. He was quiet for long enough that the silence developed texture. "May I come in?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. I stepped back. Of course. He walked past me and I caught the faint trace of his cologne. Something dark and clean. Cedar, maybe. The kind of scent that didn't announce itself but stayed. He stood in the center of my living room and looked at it with an expression I couldn't read, which was his default expression, which was always the problem. The scattered contracts. The coffee-stained pages. The laptop still open on the floor. "You were working," he said. "Yes." I crossed my arms, then uncrossed them. The indemnification clause. I found the liability loop. Something shifted in his face. Fractional, barely there. "I know." I blinked. Then why didn't you?" "I wanted to see how long it took you." He looked at me then, directly, with the particular kind of attention that always made me feel like I was being measured for something I hadn't agreed to. 3 days. You're getting faster." I didn't know what to do with that, so I did what I always did when Hakjin said something that destabilized me. I redirected. "Is there something you need, Mr. Yoon? I can have the memo ready by—" "Sit down, Marianne." The way he said my name was different from how anyone else said it. Not louder, not softer. Just more deliberate, like each syllable had been placed rather than spoken. I sat on the edge of the couch. He remained standing, which felt intentional, and looked at the window for a moment before turning back to me. "There's going to be a problem," he said, and something in his tone, controlled as always, precise as always, told me that the problem he was referring to had nothing to do with the contract I'd been working on all night. The problem, as Hakjin explained it, was a man named Derek Osei. He said the name the way he said most things that concerned him, without apparent emotion, which somehow made it worse. He sat down then, finally, in the armchair across from the couch, and the shift in the room's energy was immediate. He filled space differently than other people. Not because of his size, he wasn't the largest man I'd ever seen, but because of the quality of his stillness. When Hakjin Yoon stopped moving, everything around him seemed to adjust accordingly, like the air itself understood the hierarchy. I knew Derek. Of course I knew Derek. We'd been seeing each other for about 4 months. Nothing serious, or nothing I'd let become serious, which was a distinction I'd been careful to maintain mostly for my own protection. He worked in private equity, lived in a clean apartment in Chelsea, made me laugh at dinner and didn't ask too many questions about my job. He was safe. He was uncomplicated. He was exactly the kind of person I'd chosen because choosing him required almost nothing of me. "He came to the office," Hakjin said. My stomach went very still. "He what?" "This afternoon. He asked for you at the front desk." His eyes were on me, steady and dark. "He was told you weren't available. He left a note." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a folded piece of paper on the coffee table between us. He didn't push it toward me. He simply left it there, like a fact he was presenting rather than a gesture he was making. I looked at the note. Then I looked at him. You read it. It wasn't an accusation. I wasn't sure I had the right to make it one. Hakjin's silence confirmed it without apology. And I understood, as I had understood for months, that the boundary between my professional life and whatever he considered his domain was drawn by him and not by me. I unfolded the note. Derek's handwriting was cramped and slightly tilted to the left. Called 3 times. Heard you've been working late every night. Starting to wonder if it's actually work. We need to talk. D. I set it down. He's not a problem, I said carefully. He came to my building. Hakjin's voice didn't change. That was the thing about him. The temperature of his words never rose, which meant you couldn't track his anger by sound. You had to watch his hands, his jaw, the particular quality of his focus. Right now his hands were perfectly still on the armrests. He asked for you by name at the front desk of a location that is not publicly associated with my business interests. He knows I work for you. Not in any specific sense, but he knows you're my employer. He's probably just... He's asking questions, Marianne. The way he said it landed flat and heavy, and I finally understood that this wasn't about jealousy or inconvenience. This was about exposure. In Hakjin's world, someone asking questions near a nerve, even innocently, even stupidly, was not a small thing. I pressed my fingers against my knee to keep them from fidgeting. I'll handle it. I know you will. He looked at me for a moment longer than necessary. How long has this been going on? 4 months, approximately. You didn't mention it. It wasn't relevant to my work. Something moved through his expression then, brief and unnameable. He looked away toward the window again, at the midtown lights bleeding amber through the glass, and I watched his profile in that light, and felt something shift in the room that I didn't want to name either. No, he said. I suppose it wasn't. The silence that followed was different from his usual silences. Those I'd learned to navigate, they were functional, purposeful, spaces he used to think or to watch, or to let pressure do the work that words would have done less efficiently. This one had an edge to it that I couldn't quite locate. Like something had been said inside it that neither of us had actually said. I stood up, because sitting felt suddenly wrong. I walked to the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water, more to have something to do with my hands than out of any real hospitality instinct. When I came back, he took the glass without comment, which was as close to thank you as Hakjin generally got. There's something else, he said. I lowered myself back onto the couch. Okay. He set the glass down on the table with deliberate care. The Lim family is in New York. They arrived yesterday. I'll need you at the reception on Friday, not as staff, as a guest. I stared at him. The Lim family was one of the most significant connections in Hakjin's network. I knew the name from documents I'd processed, from calls I'd transcribed, from the particular tension that entered every room whenever they were mentioned. They were old money and older power, with enough influence across 3 states that even Hakjin's people moved more quietly when their name came up. As a guest, I repeated. There will be a dinner at the Mandarin Oriental. 40 people, private event, curated list. He paused. I need someone beside me who can read the room without being asked to. That was what I was, I reminded myself. That was the function I served. Not just logistics and paperwork, but presence, intelligence. He'd used me in rooms before, positioned me where I could hear things he wasn't supposed to be listening for, or where my being there shifted the social geometry in ways that served him. I understood the role. I'd accepted it when I took the job, but something about the word beside stayed in my chest longer than it should have. I'll need something appropriate to wear, I said, because it was practical, and practical was the only ground I trusted. That's already handled. He said it without a flicker of hesitation, which meant he'd made that decision before he arrived tonight. before he'd even knocked on my door. He'd come here knowing what he was going to ask, and knowing what he was going to provide, and the fact that I hadn't known any of it, that I'd been sitting on my floor in a bleach-stained shirt while he'd already planned this, made something tighten behind my eyes. "You came here tonight to tell me this," I said slowly. "You could have called." He looked at me then, and the look lasted exactly long enough to make my pulse do something I actively chose to ignore. "I could have," he agreed. He stood. The movement was smooth and unhurried, and he straightened his jacket with the automatic precision of someone who'd spent years cultivating the habit of always looking composed. His 2 men would be waiting at the elevator. There would be a car downstairs. His evening would continue in some direction I had no visibility into, toward decisions I didn't know about, in rooms I'd never see. He walked toward the door, and I followed at a distance that felt appropriate, which was its own kind of learned behavior. At the threshold, he stopped. He didn't turn around fully, just enough for me to see the angle of his jaw, the dark line of his tattoo against his collar. "End it with him, Marianne." He wasn't asking. He wasn't threatening. He was stating something the way he stated everything, as a fact that simply hadn't materialized yet but would, because he'd decided it would. He left before I could answer. The door closed with a soft click, and I stood in my living room with the note still on the coffee table, and the water glass he'd touched still slightly damp on its surface. And I tried very hard to convince myself that the only reason my hands weren't quite steady was because I was tired. I almost believed it. I ended things with Derek on Thursday morning, over the phone, which I knew wasn't gracious, but which was the only way I could guarantee I wouldn't let his reasonable hurt talk me into something I'd already decided. He didn't take it badly, exactly. He took it confused, which was somehow worse. "Is there someone else?" he asked, and I said no, because technically that was true. And the pause that followed told me he didn't quite believe me but wasn't sure enough to push. We hung up after 6 minutes. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall for a while, not quite sad and not quite fine, existing in that flat gray space between the two that I'd gotten familiar with over the years, whenever I made a practical decision that happened to cost me something. I told myself Hakjin was right, that Derek coming to the office was a genuine problem, that 4 months of dinners in Chelsea wasn't worth a security vulnerability, that I'd known from the beginning it wasn't going anywhere real. All of that was true. It was completely, factually true. It was also true that Hakjin had stood in my living room and told me to end it, and I had, and that the order of those 2 events was not coincidental. I didn't examine that too closely. I'd learned that some things in my life required a careful distance from examination. Friday arrived with the particular pressure of a day that has been waiting for you. The dress was delivered to my apartment Thursday afternoon. A garment bag hanging on my door with a card that had nothing written on it, because Hakjin never wrote cards. Inside was a floor-length gown in deep burgundy, silk crepe, structured at the shoulders and clean in its lines. No excessive ornamentation. Elegant in the way that very expensive things manage to be elegant, by making restraint look effortless. It fit perfectly, which should have surprised me more than it did. I arrived at the Mandarin Oriental at 7:58. The private event space on the upper floor had been arranged with the precision of something that had been planned over weeks. Round tables dressed in ivory and gold, low floral arrangements that didn't obstruct sightlines, lighting warm enough to soften but bright enough to see. 40 people, Hakjin had said. I counted 37 as I entered, and swept the room with the practiced discretion I'd developed over 14 months of being useful in places where overt observation was unwelcome. I found him without looking for him, which was always how it happened. There was a gravitational quality to Hakjin's presence in a room, not theatrical, nothing as simple as that. It was more that the room organized itself differently around him. Conversations angled slightly in his direction. People who hadn't looked up when I entered had already been oriented toward him for some time. He was standing near the far window with 2 men I didn't recognize, and one I did. Thomas Lim, mid-50s, silver at his temples, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Hokjin was listening. He had the particular quality of attention he deployed in high-stakes settings. Absolute focus dressed as casual interest. He saw me the moment I crossed the threshold. I knew because the almost imperceptible shift in his posture told me so, even though his eyes didn't move to me immediately. That was another thing I'd learned. Hokjin's awareness of a room always ran about 30 seconds ahead of his visible acknowledgement of it. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and found a position near the room's edge, close enough to be accessible, far enough to observe. This was the role. I knew it well. What I wasn't prepared for was Soo-yeon Lim. She appeared at Hokjin's side about 20 minutes into the evening, and the way she moved toward him, unhesitating, familiar, with a small smile that suggested a history I hadn't known existed, sent something cold and sharp through my chest before I could stop it. She was beautiful in a composed, deliberate way. Her dress was ivory, her hair pinned up with quiet precision. She touched Hokjin's arm when she reached him. He didn't pull away. I watched Thomas Lim smile at the exchange. I watched 2 of Hokjin's men exchange a glance that meant something I couldn't decode from across the room. I watched Hokjin say something to Soo-yeon that made her laugh, soft and private. The laugh of someone who felt safe with the person in front of them. I looked away. I took a long sip of sparkling water and reminded myself, firmly, what I was here for. A woman appeared beside me. Late 40s, sharp eyes, wearing the relaxed confidence of someone who never had to try very hard in rooms like this. She extended a hand. "You're with Yoon's people," she said. Not a question. "Marianne," I said. "I work with him, yes." "Grace Lim." A slight smile. "Thomas's wife." I kept my expression neutral and professional. "It's a lovely event." "It is." She looked at me for a moment, the way women sometimes look at each other when they're deciding how much to say. "Have you worked for Hokjin long?" 14 months. She sipped her wine. "Then you probably know about the arrangement." Something in my throat went very still. "I'm sorry?" Grace glanced toward where Hokjin and Soo-yeon were still standing, and something in her expression was almost sympathetic. Not unkind, just honest, in the way that people who've lived in powerful families for decades sometimes dispensed honesty, like a small, uncomfortable gift. "Our families have had an understanding for some time," she said. "Hokjin and Soo-yeon. It was formalized in January." She paused. "The wedding is planned for September." The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Wedding. I heard it. I processed it. I kept my face completely, professionally still, which took more effort than anything I'd done in a very long time. "I see," I said. "She's a good match for him," Grace continued, in the tone of someone who had made peace with a thing she hadn't chosen. "Smart girl. Understands the world he lives in." Another pause. "I imagine you understand it too, in your own way." I wasn't sure exactly what she meant by that. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I excused myself a few minutes later, moving toward the far side of the room with measured steps, nodding at a man who tried to engage me in conversation about commercial real estate and extracting myself in under 2 minutes, which was a personal best. I found a quieter corner near a decorative partition and stood there for a moment, glass in hand, looking at nothing. September. Hokjin was getting married in September, and I hadn't known. And he hadn't told me. And he had come to my apartment on a Tuesday night and told me to end things with a man I'd been seeing, and none of those facts were allowed to mean what they were arranging themselves to mean in the back of my mind. I felt him before I heard him, which was typical. "You spoke with Grace Lim." His voice came from just behind my left shoulder, low and close, and I controlled my reaction to it with the discipline of someone who'd had 14 months of practice. I turned. He was closer than I'd expected, closer than was strictly professional, though in the noise of a 40-person private event, no one would have noted it. His eyes were on my face with an attention that felt, in that moment, genuinely uncomfortable in ways I didn't have clean language for. "She told me about the wedding," I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of that. Something moved across his expression. Brief, complicated, the shadow of something he chose not to develop. "That wasn't a conversation for tonight," he said. "No," I agreed, "but it happened anyway." He looked at me for a long moment. The sounds of the room continued around us. Silverware, low laughter, the murmur of negotiations dressed as small talk. None of it touched the specific silence between us. "Marianne, I should go check the seating arrangements," I said. "I noticed table 4 is short a place card." It was a clean exit and a true one, and I took it before he could say whatever the next word had been, because something in the way he'd started told me I wasn't ready to hear it. I crossed the room. I fixed the place card. I did my job, but I felt his gaze on my back for the rest of the evening, steady and unmoving, the way his gaze always was when he'd decided something hadn't finished yet. I handed in my resignation on a Monday. It wasn't an impulsive decision. I'd spent the weekend inside my apartment with the curtains halfway closed, moving between the couch and the kitchen with the mechanical energy of someone performing the motions of a normal day without any of the conviction behind them. I made coffee. I let it go cold. I opened a book and read the same paragraph 4 times before closing it and setting it face down on the cushion beside me. I thought about the Friday night at the Mandarin Oriental, the way Grace Lim had said the wedding is planned for September with that particular tone. Not cruel, just matter of fact. The way people who live inside powerful structures speak about the arrangements those structures produce. I thought about Su-Yan's hand on Hak Jin's arm and the way he hadn't moved. I thought about him standing in my living room on a Tuesday night, coming there himself, in person. Something he didn't do, and telling me to end things with Derek. And I thought about the fact that I'd done it immediately, without asking why, which told me something about myself I wasn't entirely comfortable with. I was 29 years old. I had a graduate degree in business administration from Georgetown. I was good at my job in ways that weren't simple to replace, and I had spent 14 months organizing my entire professional existence around a man who was engaged to someone else and who had walked into my apartment uninvited and rearranged my personal life with 4 quiet words. The letter was 4 sentences. Professional, clean, 2 weeks' notice, no stated reason. I emailed it to the office manager at 6:47 on Monday morning, before I could edit the certainty out of it. By 7:15, my phone rang. Not a number I recognized, but I knew anyway. I let it ring. It rang again at 7:22, then a third time at 7:30. I put the phone face down on the kitchen counter and made toast I didn't eat. At 8:04, someone knocked on my door, not the buzzer. The door itself, which meant someone had come up without being announced, which meant the building staff had made a decision based on who was asking that I probably couldn't argue with. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, weighing the option of simply not answering. Then I set down the toast and walked to the door, because avoiding Hak Jin-yoon was not a thing that actually worked. I'd understood that intellectually for months, but the last 72 hours had made it cellular. I opened the door. He was alone. That was the first thing I registered. No security visible in the hallway, which was unusual enough that it took me a moment to process. He was in a charcoal suit, no pocket square, and he looked like a man who had come somewhere directly without stopping first, which for Hak Jin was the equivalent of arriving disheveled. He looked at me. I looked at him. "No," he said. I blinked. "No?" The resignation. "No." I pulled the door open further and stepped back, because having this conversation in the doorway felt undignified for both of us. He came in, and I noticed he'd memorized the layout of my apartment from one previous visit because he moved through it without hesitation, stopping in the living room and turning to face me with the same controlled presence he brought everywhere, except something was different. There was a tension in his jaw that I hadn't seen before. Subtle, but there. "You can't simply refuse my resignation," I said. My voice was steady. I'd been practicing steadiness all weekend without realizing that was what I was doing. "It's a legal document. I'm aware of what it is." "Then you understand that I gave 2 weeks' notice, which is professional and appropriate, and that at the end of those 2 weeks..." "Why?" He said it quietly, and it cut directly through the rest of my sentence. I held his gaze. "Personal reasons." That's not an answer. It's the one I'm giving. He was quiet for a moment, and I watched him do the thing he sometimes did: absorb information, reorder it, decide which angle gave him the most useful approach. It was fascinating and maddening in equal measure, and I'd spent 14 months watching him do it to other people. And now he was doing it to me, and I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "The dinner," he said. "Grace Lim spoke to you." "Yes." "What she told you was that you're getting married in September." I kept my voice even. "Which is... Congratulations, Hakjin. Truly, she seems like a very suitable match." The last 2 words came out with a precision that was perhaps slightly too careful, and I saw something flicker across his face. "It's an arrangement," he said. "I know what it is. I understand how your world works. I've been inside it for over a year." "Then you understand that arrangements of that kind are..." "I understand all of it." My voice finally cracked the smallest amount, not in volume but in texture, and I hated it. "What I'm telling you is that understanding it doesn't mean I'm required to stay in it. I'm allowed to leave a job, Hakjin. People do it every day." He crossed the distance between us, not quickly, not aggressively, but steadily, with purpose, and stopped close enough that I had to make a conscious decision to hold my ground rather than step back. This close, I could see the details I usually kept at professional distance: the faint tension around his eyes, the way his jaw had set, the dark lines of his tattoo just above his collar. "You're not leaving because of the job," he said. It wasn't a question. It was never a question with him. "That's not your call to make," I said. "Marianne. My name, deliberate as always, placed. Look at me." "I am looking at you." "Then tell me what you actually want to say." The request landed somewhere unguarded, and I felt it. And I hated that I felt it. And I looked at him and thought about 14 months and Tuesday nights, and the dress that fit perfectly because he'd paid attention, and the word beside sitting in my chest since he'd said it, and I thought, I am so tired of being careful. "I think you came to my apartment that night because you wanted to," I said. "Not because of Derek, not because of the clause, not because of anything that needed to happen in person. I think you came here because you wanted to be here, and I think you told me to end things with him because..." I stopped, took a breath, and then I found out you're engaged, and I realized I had let something grow inside a wall I thought was solid, and it isn't, and I can't do my job like this. That's why I'm leaving. The silence that followed was different from all his other silences. This one had weight on both sides. He reached out slowly, and his hand closed around my wrist. Not roughly, not demandingly. With the careful deliberateness of someone making a decision they'd been approaching for a long time. "I called off the engagement this morning," he said. The room went very quiet. "What?" My voice came out smaller than I intended. "I called Thomas Lim at 6 a.m. The arrangement is dissolved." His thumb moved, once, against the inside of my wrist. "It was dissolved before your resignation arrived." I stared at him. "Why?" He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face in 14 months. Open, in the way that doors are open when someone has decided to stop keeping them closed. "Because I drove back from your building that Tuesday night," he said. "And I sat in my car for 23 minutes outside your address and did not leave. And that was the moment I understood I had a problem that had nothing to do with business." My heart was doing something loud and inconvenient. I looked down at his hand around my wrist. I looked back up at his face. "You dissolved an engagement with the Lim family," I said slowly. "That has consequences. Yes, significant ones, political ones, financial ones, potentially. Yes, and you did it anyway. I did it anyway." He said it without hesitation, without performance, with the same flat certainty he brought to every decision he'd ever made. Except this one had a different quality underneath it. Something human. Something that had cost him something real. I exhaled, long and unsteady, and I didn't try to hide it. "I'm still processing this," I said. "I know. I need a minute. Take it." He released my wrist, but he didn't step back. He stayed exactly where he was, close and still and present, and waited with the patience of someone who had decided where he was going to stand and saw no reason to move. Outside my window, the city continued. A cab horn somewhere below, pigeons on the ledge, morning light laying itself flat across the floor between us. I pressed my fingers to my forehead for a moment, eyes closed, and took stock of every feeling competing for space in my chest. The shock, the anger still warm underneath, the cautious disbelief, and underneath all of it, like something that had been there long enough to have its own roots, something that felt terrifyingly close to relief. When I opened my eyes, he was still there. I didn't withdraw the resignation that day. Hakjin didn't ask me to, which surprised me. He stayed another 40 minutes. We sat at the kitchen table with fresh coffee, actual hot coffee this time, and talked in a way we had never talked before. Not about contracts or logistics or the careful architecture of his business world. About the job itself, about what staying would look like, about what had already shifted between us and couldn't be shifted back. He was direct in the way he was always direct, but there was something underneath the directness now that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, and I'd simply had excellent reasons not to look at it. He left at 10:15. At the door, he paused and turned and said, "Think about what you want, not what makes sense, what you want." I stood there after he left and held those two sentences for a long time. It took me 4 days. 4 days of walking through my apartment, taking long routes through Midtown that weren't efficient and weren't meant to be. Sitting in a coffee shop on 9th Avenue for 2 hours on a Wednesday afternoon, doing nothing more productive than watching people walk by in the October wind. 4 days of being honest with myself in the way that I usually reserved for 3 in the morning when the defenses were too tired to hold their positions. What I wanted was not simple and not clean. What I wanted came with complexity and danger, and a world that operated by rules I understood well enough to know they were serious. What I wanted was also, underneath all of that, surprisingly clear. So clear that by Thursday evening it had stopped feeling like a decision, and started feeling like a fact I was simply catching up to. I called him. Not emailed, called. He picked up on the second ring, which for a man with his schedule meant he'd been waiting for it. "I want to renegotiate," I said. "A beat. Terms. I won't be an assistant anymore. If I stay, it's as an equal partner on operations. I want real decision-making input, not just implementation. I want that in writing." I paused. "And whatever this is between us, it moves at my pace, not yours. You don't get to decide the speed of this one." The silence lasted long enough that I held my breath without meaning to. "Agreed," he said. "All of it." I let the breath out. "Then I'll see you Monday." The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. I want to be clear about that. because the truth of it mattered more than any version that would have been easier to tell. There were consequences to the dissolved engagement, exactly as I'd predicted. Thomas Lim was not gracious about it. Not publicly, but within the network of relationships that structured Hakjin's world. The withdrawal created friction that took months to manage. Hakjin managed it with the same controlled precision he brought to everything, but I watched him absorb the weight of it, and I understood the cost in real terms, rather than abstract ones. He never said he regretted it. Not once. Not in the way that people sometimes say things because they want credit for the sacrifice. He simply didn't mention it, which was its own kind of statement. I renegotiated my role. The contract took 2 weeks to finalize, because I pushed back on 3 clauses and he pushed back on 2 of mine, and we reached an agreement that neither of us found entirely comfortable, which I privately believed was the sign of a fair negotiation. I had actual authority now, real input on operational decisions, access to information I'd previously been kept adjacent to rather than inside. It changed how I moved through his world. It changed how his people looked at me. Some of them didn't like it. I was aware of that, and I let myself be aware of it without letting it change my posture. I had learned that from Hakjin, that how you carry awareness matters as much as what you're aware of. Hakjin and I moved slowly. That had been my condition, and he honored it without complaint, which told me more about him than 14 months of working beside him had. There were dinners, real ones, not business dressed as meals, but actual evenings where neither of us was performing a function. He was different in those spaces, still contained, still precise, but with a quality of presence that he didn't bring to rooms full of people, something quieter, and, underneath the quiet, something warmer than I'd expected from a man I'd spent over a year believing I understood. He was possessive. I'd known that before any of this began. I'd watched it operate in professional contexts, the way he moved people and resources as though their positions in the world were partly his to determine. Applied personally, it was something I had to actively negotiate. He didn't like it when I worked late at the office without telling him. He didn't like certain people in close proximity to me without reason. Once, early on, a man at an industry event spent 20 minutes too close to me, and Hakjin materialized beside me with a quietness so complete that the man excused himself without appearing to know why. And I had to decide in that moment whether to be annoyed or to admit, honestly, that something in me had been grateful. I told him about the grateful part. He didn't gloat. He simply looked at me for a moment with those dark, steady eyes and said, "I know." And the fact that he knew, that he'd always been able to read me that clearly, should have been unsettling, and was instead something I was slowly making my peace with. By February, 7 months after that Tuesday night in my living room, I had stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. That was how I measured it. Not by grand gestures, not by milestones, but by the morning I woke up in my apartment with gray winter light coming through the window and realized I wasn't bracing for anything. The job was harder now. Real input meant real responsibility, and there were days when the weight of what Hakjin's world actually contained pressed against me in ways that required honest conversations about what I could carry. We had those conversations. He listened in the way he listened to things that mattered, fully, without interruption, without immediately trying to solve. That had surprised me most of all, that he could simply sit inside a difficult truth with me without reaching to fix it into something easier. Marcus's shirt was still in my apartment, the one with the bleach stain that I'd been wearing the night Hakjin appeared at my door without warning and changed the shape of everything. I still wore it on slow Sundays, and once Hakjin saw it and asked about it, and I told him about Marcus, my older brother, the one who'd passed 4 years ago, the one whose absence had left a shape in my life I'd mostly learned to work around rather than through. He didn't say he was sorry in the reflexive way people did. He asked me what Marcus had been like, and I told him. And we sat with it together for a while, and that was the night something settled in me that I hadn't realized was still unsettled. In March, He asked me to move. Not urgently, not as a command. He'd learned where that line was, or I'd taught him, or some combination of both. He asked in the way he now asked things that were personal rather than professional. Directly, but with room inside the directness for me to actually answer. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 11 days, which was not 4 days, which was its own kind of data point about how much harder this decision felt than the one that had come before it. On the 12th day, I said yes, not because it made perfect sense, not because every concern I had was resolved, but because I had stood in the middle of my midtown apartment and tried to picture the version of my life where I said no, and I couldn't find it, couldn't locate it with any real conviction. It kept sliding away from me like something that had already stopped being available. I gave up my apartment on a Thursday in April. I stood in the empty living room for a few minutes before I left. The space where the couch had been, the window where midtown light came in at a certain angle in the evenings, the floor where I'd been sitting in Marcus's shirt with spilled coffee and scattered paper clips when a man had knocked on my door and rearranged everything I thought I knew about my own life. I turned off the light, and I left. Hakjin was waiting downstairs. He was standing outside the car rather than inside it, which he didn't do, which meant he'd chosen to. And when I came out the front door of the building, he looked at me the way he sometimes looked at me now that I'd stopped pretending not to notice. And I walked toward him across the sidewalk in the April air, thinking that I still didn't know everything this life would cost me. But I knew what it felt like to be seen by someone who didn't look away. And I had decided 11 days of thinking and a 12th day of clarity. That was worth more than any version of safety I'd been keeping myself inside. He opened the car door. I got in. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't look back.